Shut that back up. All right. Blackboard. Sorry, I should have downloaded this before I started the lecture up, but I'll do it really quick. So today we're going to talk about text. And next week, remember, everybody should remember that it's Thanksgiving, that we're not meeting for this class. I think the week after that, is it the last week or is there one more week after that? Okay. Sometimes that works out differently. Oops, wrong course. But I think there's only 1 week of new material, right? Maybe. Sometimes I put a review session week in, or maybe I just pushed some of the material because we missed a week already. Anyway, fall 2016 cross list. All right. Now I did have this up. Oh, I had some people email and say that the USA zip file was corrupted. Was that everybody? Did it work for some? Okay. It was the same. It also failed. Okay. If anybody has any additional problems getting that data, let me know. All right. Okay, so today we're going to talk about kind of brief, but the lab is pretty long. You guys don't need to show your hands, but I did put it out there, so if you got a head start on it, that's great. If you have questions, I'll be here today to answer them. There's no TA up here today. He had to go to conference. All right. I'm showing this slide, but you don't have to memorize everything on this slide. But what I want to get across here is that there are people that spend a lot of time studying and categorizing and looking into type. Okay? Because it may be more of a minor consideration, but type does lend a lot of feeling in terms of the mood or the era, the general sense of the map when you're looking at it. Okay, you look at a map, it has certain type, you're trying to send a certain message. Okay? So when people develop typefaces, they think about these sorts of things, and they fit into different categories. Okay, you can think of it being an older type or a newer type or modern type. Of course, the label modern got used so much in recent history that modern doesn't necessarily mean something that we're using right now, but it's a more recent form of the type. And there are reasons why type changed over time. We'll talk about some of that today. So yeah, you don't have to memorize anything. We will make a distinction. This might appear on the test. I don't know, but I haven't written the test yet. But we will make a big distinction between types as being serif or sans serif. So you should remember this term. So these little things that this one's called an ear. But these are definitely serifs. And serifs can have different styles to them. They could be blocks, wedges, whatnot. You don't have to memorize all those. But know what a serif is. This font here, this letter here, doesn't have serifs. Neither does the E here. Okay? But the B has a serif, and so does the S. So sans serif font, sans means without. We do use text in a lot of ways on maps that you may not have considered or thought about, or maybe you have, but there are 4 basic categories for text, and these fall into descriptive text, analytical text, positional text, and metadata. So you should be able to categorize text into each of those categories. You don't have to categorize something further than that. Okay, but in general, when we like see something like a I started it. The lecture. In general, when we see something on a map that says something like a scenic route or a sunken wreck or rescue post, that would be descriptive text. Okay? It's describing an entity on the map, but not labeling it by its name. Okay? Names also fit into this category. That's narrative text. And that's describing something, anything that describes a feature on the map. Okay? Then there's analytical text that help people interpret the map. They're not labeling items on the map or saying something about an item. They're actually making a connection for you. That's analytical text. And then positional text is any text that helps you reference the geographic position on the map. So that might be labeling the graticule. You'll often see positional text doing that. Sometimes, though, there'll be a mark that actually says this happened here, or this. Well, you often see peaks marked on a map. So a peak, that would. Saying the name of the peak would be descriptive text, but saying that the location here would be the positional text, sometimes with the elevation labeled and maybe even the latitude and longitude of that particular feature. Okay, metadata is oftentimes data that describes the information on the map. Oftentimes, something like the ellipsoid or the projection information would be something that was more often shown on the map, would be metadata. Okay, this is a slide from the book. There are a fair number of categories for text. We've got black letter, we've got old style, transitional, modern, sans serif. Sans serif means without serifs. You have script or cursive display. Usually on a map, there's not too much of a place for that, unless it's like a title, or if you're trying to. It was an advertisement for Coca-Cola or something, and you actually had the font that they use, not the font, but the fancy script that they use for Coke, that would be appropriate, but not all over the map, unless it was a very specific purpose map. All right. So this is another way to categorize things. So we talked about serif and sans serif. That's a very broad category. But we can also categorize things by old style, transitional, or modern. Modern fonts. This really gets into how fonts developed over time. Okay? In old style fonts, because they developed from printing presses, even the hairlines or the thinner lines on the fonts had to be wider or heavier because the materials for printing we're actually printing with materials rather than like spraying ink on a page. So those materials over time would wear out if they weren't heavy duty. Okay? And when they were just wood a long time ago, they would wear out quickly. But even metal would wear out over time if the lines weren't heavier. So old style fonts are typically categorized by having heavier hairlines. In other words, even the thinner lines were heavier because they were relying on softer materials to print on the page. Likewise, you'd have blunt serifs because having a very thin point wasn't practical. So old style fonts have that, and using an old style font will give the user the impression that you're going back in time. It'd be an appropriate map for making a map of 17th, 16th century Europe. Okay. Transitional fonts were characterized by the use of harder metals to create the typefaces. When we talk about making printing press, I don't know exactly when the printing press was invented, but Gutenberg and all those guys that invented the printing press. We have one of the great revolutions was the ability to have movable type. So when I say the typefaces, I'm actually talking about these little blocks of type that were used that could be moved around and reused. Anyway, harder materials allowed for tighter or smaller hairlines, smaller but still rounded serifs, and thin horizontal lines. And then finally we have modern fonts, which saw kind of a going back to a little bit wider hairlines and neater serif lines. So fitting things into these categories, old style, transitional, modern. Oftentimes you'll see fonts with these names. Sometimes they'll actually say something old style, like Galley old style. These are some examples. People still use these type of fonts. Arial, Helvetica are very popular sans serif fonts. I don't know exactly which one of these appear when you go into Word or whatnot, but.
Would you use the mostly like time that you were saying at the time you got a map is when you would use old style, modern, transitional, and kind of like in between the transitional stages? Or is it kind of just how you feel about it?
Yeah, it's kind of how you feel about the map. There are plenty of times when you could use an old style font on a newer map. So yeah, just make sure it goes with the mood of the map. So here's some examples of certain moods of different fonts impart to a map. It might impart to a map. Dignity, power, grace. Sounds like you're making a great map or something. Precision. Sans serif, oftentimes sans serif fonts. Well, sans serif fonts are something that's become very popular over the last 15 years. So you'll see maps that don't have a lot of serifs on them. Of course, we're kind of transitioning out of that. I think a little bit. Now, with maps, generally, it says a mixture of typefaces. Generally, you don't want to use too many typefaces unless your mood is kind of like fun or almost like comical to use lots of typefaces. All right. Typically, you want to stick to 2 or 3 typefaces at the most on a map. And by that, I don't mean pick 2 from old style and 2 from transitional. I just mean just 2 or 3 from the total list. Some cartographers say it's best to just have 1 sans serif font that you're going to use and 1 serif font that you're going to use. Okay, 1 of each. There may be a reason to use more. But remember, even within a font, you have the ability to choose between bold, italic, and then bold and italic. So even within a font, you have a few, particular typeface, you have a few different choices. So here's some examples of text. So the point here is that typically if you have text in a block like this, sans serif font is what's been used for a long period of time. And the reason that the serifs actually even exist is that they help our eyes move across the page better. And they're visual cues to keep your eyes moving forward. And so if you have a block of text on your map like this, where somebody's reading a paragraph, it's a good choice to use a serif font. That's one of the main reasons for choosing serif over sans serif, is that serif fonts are good for titles and individual labels. Sorry, sans serif fonts. serif fonts are great for blocks of text in general. So Times New Roman is a very, I think it's the default for Word, at least it was when I was growing up. Times New Roman, a very popular serif font, and Futuro Light, actually that's not as common. Arial is probably the most common. Helvetica is on Macs is I think the default. One of my students said that there's some documentary that's just on the Helvetica font. Or maybe it's on fonts in general, but the title of it had something to do with Helvetica. I made a note to go look it up sometime, and I never did. So Helvetica is an Apple font. Arial is used by PC. To me, they look pretty similar, but some people evidently the student said some people have a strong feeling that Helvetica is where it's at.
I just remember Steve Jobs freaking out about font size.
Right. In his show, but evidently, yeah, he's one of the advocates of Helvetica over Arial. All right, so Times New Roman. These are some other examples of fonts. All right, uppercase versus lowercase. That's the A example there. The reason that they actually referred to as uppercase and lowercase is that when we did have movable fonts, and they're actually typefaces that were grabbing from a bin, they kept the uppercase in the uppercase and the lowercase in the lowercase, and so they could quickly get the things that they needed. All right. Now there is an advantage. One reason why we don't just write everything in uppercase is that it actually is easier to read and identify a word in lowercase. Maybe that's an accident of the way things were created, but it's easier because we recognize the entire shape of the word faster than if everything's in uppercase. So that's what that point is trying to get across, is that oftentimes it's easier, especially when text is small, to read Boston in mixed case than it is entirely in uppercase. The point here is that for the same reason, actually, it's actually easier to read words when you see the top of them than the bottom of them. So the top of words changes more often than the bottom of those words change. It has a more distinct profile. So when you're planning your text, you have to obscure. You shouldn't have to entirely obscure a word, but if that word has to go into mix into some other background material, it should be more above that background material, as much as above that background material as possible, not to obscure the top of that particular line. This has, a slide like this has less and less meaning over time, but I'm sure that you've all at least heard the term TrueType font. And TrueType fonts are basically vectors. As GIS people, we might know what we mean there. And the lines that describe the TrueType font are actually stored in the computer as points with Bezier curves in between them. And so they can be scaled perfectly. So they can be scaled up, they can be scaled down. However, when they're printed on a page or when they're put on a computer screen, they're converted, no matter what, because all computer screens and all pages are just a bunch of dots. So even if your TrueType font scales perfectly, which fonts do nowadays, almost all fonts are TrueType fonts. A non-TrueType font is actually stored as a raster, and so if you scale it, it looks terrible. But the point still stands that when we print on a page or print on a screen, we're going to get dots on that. And technology has reached the point where there are almost imperceptible small dots on a screen. However, there is a limit that's still visible, at least on the screens we have here. If you make your text too small, you start to not recognize that letter as well. So that's one reason why we can't make letters really, really tiny, because those dots start to make it look like, if you look at these dots behind the G, it's a little harder to tell it's a G if we remove the lines that represent that G. So you just have to keep that in mind. There's another slide showing a very similar concept. So that smooth thing, if it was blown up, and we're making a very small G, we couldn't make that line as precise, that capital G. I should have shown this slide earlier. Again, you don't need to remember any of these terms. In the old days, way before I was born, well, actually, not, newspapers were still printed not too long before I was born with this type of movable type. But anyway, nowadays everything's definitely digital. So type was actually printed on page using a positive cutout of the type itself. And so they're arranged not only in cases, but also by point sizes. And a point is still a unit of measure that's used. So I think there's a slide on this. Yeah, it's the next slide. 72 points fonts is that font appears 1 inch tall. The capital letters appear 1 inch tall on the map or on the printed page. It just doesn't have to be a map. So 36 is half of that. So that's a ½ inch tall on the page. Obviously, on this slide, it appears much bigger for you guys. You see it as much larger. Okay? But everything else can be scaled like that. So 6-point font, how many times does 6 go into 72? What's that, 12? Okay, cool. So it's 1/12 of an inch on the page. So, and this was invented back when more of the world was using imperial units, so this is still the case. Anywhere in the world, they're going to use points as the unit of measure for fonts, and if you actually want to know how big it will be on the page, you can do that math and figure out how big it will be. Okay. All right, so when we put lettering on a map, another thing to consider is the background. When backgrounds are filled, when you have filled backgrounds, such as like a hillshade or a raster or even an image in the background, we're going to have issues where lettering is hard to see when using background fill, whether or not it's dark or light text. And so one of the ways around that is to use a box around the text. That doesn't always look really nice. Sometimes there's a good reason for that, to have just a straight box. And then sometimes it's better to use what we call a halo. Okay? So D has a halo or a glow around the text. ArcGIS has a way to do this. I think that was part of the lab, was to do this, but if not, I can demonstrate that. It's pretty easy. You just go into text properties, and then there are a couple tabs to hit. One of the things that people often don't realize that you can change, even on a map, are the distance between the characters. Most fonts nowadays, most TrueType fonts that are on computers, actually are kerned. And what that means is that the spacing is dynamic. The space between a and a V is actually smaller. In fact, even we're trying to say here, if you look at this A, the A actually ends after the V is started. If you were to draw a line up from the A to the V, it goes backward. It's like a backward, like in football, it's like a backward lateral there. But here, with no kerning, the A starts, the V doesn't start until the next letter. So kerning wasn't really possible when we're using movable type. But kerning is possible, and actually most people think it makes text look better. And so most computers now use either auto kerning or optical kerning to dynamically change the size of the text. I don't believe, maybe ArcGIS has the ability to turn this off and on. I'm not positive, but this is the default to have kerning on your text. There are some fonts that don't use kerning by default. And you probably noticed those, like the Courier is one of them. They're meant to look like a typewriter because a typewriter can't do kerning either. Kerning is not letter spacing. It's not the same as letter spacing. This is letter spacing. Tracking is letter spacing. And it's how far apart the letters are from their usual positions. Okay? This is just how close they are together. This is how close they can get shoved together in, like, as a puzzle piece. This is kind of the spacing of all of the letters. This is definitely able to be changed in ArcGIS. You can adjust tracking, and there's some good reasons for doing so. Sometimes you just want to make a distinction between something on a map versus something else on a map, and you want to have two different labels. So you make one a little bit wider. Okay? That's probably less common as the second one. Oftentimes, you'll adjust the tracking or the letter spacing when you're trying to fill a polygon. And you'll see this on maps of countries. You'll see actually pretty big kerning. Like, for example, the word Canada is pretty short for how big a country Canada is. So you might see C, big space, A, big space, N, big space, A. All right, that's tracking. Now, the next concept is called leading. Now, leading is mostly for annotation when you have a block of text on your screen. Leading doesn't really mean anything for labels on a map that are just floating in different places, because leading is line spacing. And the reason it was called leading is because back when we were using these guys, when they were changing the line spacing, they actually had strips of lead. Lead was more malleable than other metals, but still held itself up pretty well. So you had different strips to space in between each line. So sometimes you'll see it called leading, sometimes you'll see it called line spacing. But leading is the older term for it. It's basically line spacing. You might want to use that to fill up a certain portion of a map. Because on a map, oftentimes we are concerned about things like balance, and sometimes we do want to fill up a certain section, so we want to make the text take up more room. And one of the things that we can do is adjust the leading or the line spacing. All right, now this is a slide from your book, so I'll let you read it all up on there. But there are a lot of kind of general guidelines for putting text on maps, and these are good rules to follow. So in general, you don't want to break these rules, but they can be broken in specific cases. But they're conventions, I guess you could say. So people are used to these sort of things being on maps. I've already said the first one, you want text to be smaller than 6 points. I think I've actually mentioned the second one there before. Water features are typically shown in italics on maps. If you think about the maps that you've seen, you'll recognize that most of the time we're using italics for water. Typically, you want them labeled in blue, unless the water itself is blue, and then you make the label something else. Sorry, unless the water itself is blue. You don't want to use too much bold. So you want to use mixed case with capital letters. If you do use all caps to label something, like labeling countries in all caps, you want that to typically be the highest administrative level if you're mapping administrative things. All right. We're going to talk about a few of these other ones as we go through it, but Yeah, you don't want to like place text halfway in land and halfway in water usually. No, don't have upside. We're going to talk about that. We'll talk about a number of these. Okay. All right. So here we have Baltimore displayed on two different maps, and this shows some of the rules from this one. Typically, when we label a point, there are rules about where to put that point. We actually have a slide on that, a couple slides later. Okay? But you want to be consistent in your placement. So you have a first priority, a second priority, a third priority, a fourth priority, maybe even a fifth and sixth priority. And so all of your labels should be placed at the first priority if possible. If they don't fit there, then you can move it to a different location. All right. If you have an area that you're representing, you ideally place the words inside that area. If the area is too small to place the words inside of it, you treat that area as a point, and then you use your rules for where you're going to put the label of points in terms of the priority. So we've got on this side France, Spain, Portugal, and Portugal. Even if Spain wasn't like over here, maybe this would be a bad choice because it wasn't placing it above and to the left. That's the first priority. All right. Typically, you place your labels horizontally always. There are some exceptions to that, like if you have a curved grid, you might want to have your labels go along the curved grid. Also, if you're labeling a linear feature, like a river or even a road, there are some cases where you'd want that to, and actually have a slide that shows that in a second here. All right, so these are the Emenhoff and Yoli rules, okay, for label placement. So the first one is actually the upper right-hand corner. The reason why that one wasn't chosen for Baltimore is that would have interrupted the water. So we chose the second best location. Right? So this is the first location, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh and eighth in priority. Okay, so labeling a city, these are the locations where the best location for those dots will be. ArcGIS actually has a method for labeling these automatically, or choosing these rules automatically. Now, the thing is, ArcGIS is pretty complex, but it does have some issues with seeing all of the other layers that you have on there. Okay, so it might not do a very good job, and so you'll learn in today's lab, if you haven't already started it, that you start out with the defaults, but then you are going to have to do a lot of moving these around. Okay, this is the lab where you're actually doing the most mechanical work. And you'll find that if you want to create a good map, okay, like let's say you're going to a conference and you want to actually make your map look right, you're going to have to do this, whether or not you have 20 labels or 1,000 labels. Even if you have 20 labels, if you just let ArcGIS choose the location of the labels, your map's not going to look that good. It's going to look like you just turned on ArcGIS. I mean, I see these all the time at conferences. People just turn on ArcGIS and said label the features, and they were done with it. Almost always, you're going to have to do what this lab teaches you to do, and that is to place the labels automatically and then go in and turn them into annotation and move them around slightly. Okay? And typically, that's one of the last steps that you do, because once you turn them into annotation, you kind of lose the ability to have ArcGIS place them automatically. All right. So, labeling linear features, if you follow the linear feature, which is a good practice for things like roads and rivers, there are some ways where you do not want them. Some of these are obvious. Like these on the left, let's say wrong right here, that are upside down. That's obvious that that doesn't look good, right? Even these even these two that are only partially upside down on the wrong side. Okay, but what's not as obvious is the ones that are on a straight line, they're going down. Technically, that doesn't look as correct as the ones that are labeled correct on the straight line. So typically you want the text going up if the line is perfectly up and down. All right. So here's an example. If I was using ArcGIS, it would probably give me a map that looked like the not like this example if I said label the features, because it doesn't necessarily see the coastline. So create that based on the rules for the best being in the right hand side. Rockland probably wouldn't fit if it was above and to the right, so down. Anyway, so not like that, like this. We've moved all of the labels off of their original positions a bit so that they can be not on that line that's below them. Okay. It doesn't take a whole lot of effort. I mean, okay, if there's a lot of labels, it takes a lot of effort, but individually, we're just moving little points around. It does take some effort, but all right. So you want the labels to appear above the text, not below them. I mean, sorry, the labels to appear above the feature, not below them. So this gets kind of hairy when you've got a lot of rivers that go all over the place. Just make sure, like on the example on the right, the not like this example, that word river is upside down. It'd be better to put the name up on the like this, up where it doesn't have to be upside down. So if you can move the position of the label, then it's better, even if you have to abbreviate like they did with the Willamette River. This is up near Portland. Portland is kind of close to the confluence of the Willamette and the Columbia there. All right, so here's another example showing from your book. Showing the ideal is to put the label inside of the polygon feature. If it doesn't fit in the polygon feature, use the point label rules. So the upper right is the best. The upper right works fine for that bottom lake, the Stevens Lake, but the upper right would have been a little crowded for the Redland Pond. You probably could have horseshoed it in there. It just wouldn't look right. Okay, make sure that has enough room to breathe. So put it all, over to the upper left. Looks better. There is some art involved in labeling. All right, here's an example of doing a bit of kerning, labeling the Cascade Mountains going up, like that. Typically something that's on, like, we might like label individual features on there and we use mixed cases, but if you're going to label in all uppercase too, it should be something on the highest order. Here, the largest feature, the Cascade Mountains. Maybe if this is a map of the whole United States, you'd also have one that said Rocky Mountains and Appalachia Mountains. That was big. All right, text appears all over on your map. Here we've got text on the scale bars. And the scale bars themselves, you don't want them to be overcomplicated. Here's some north arrows. I should take this slide out. I don't necessarily see what the big deal on this one is. Not like this slide. I mean, those all look like acceptable north arrows to me. In fact, the one that I think is the worst is on the like this category. Anyway. So it is 2:24. Yeah, let's take like a 10-minute break, and then I'll go over the lab. If you've already done the lab and you think that you